Welcome to the Leadership Drip, coffee and conversations for leaders leading the next generation. We're excited to welcome to the table another incredible guest. But before we do, could you do us a favor and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode? While you're at it, go ahead and give us a 5-star review. That helps these conversations reach other great leaders. Pour yourself a cup of coffee and get ready to join us at the table for another great episode of the Leadership Drip. Rob, welcome back to the table, my friend. You have hot coffee. I've chosen water this go round to hydrate. But I'll probably have coffee too. So that
is the worst podcast introduction you've ever had. Like,
is it really?
I needed to hydrate. What is that? Like,
I don't know.
It's the Leadership Drip.
Well,
bro.
I'm fully caffeinated already from all the coffee earlier. So
whatever.
Anyways,
lame.
Yeah. Hey, good news is, let's share this with our listeners. You are almost Dr. Rob. Like you submitted your dissertation last week?
That is true. I submitted my dissertation last week, finally.
We'll be defending sometime in April.
I'll be defending in the early weeks of April, I believe.
So now I feel bad because now at the table with us is Dr. Rob Nearly. Mm-hmm. I'm just Jeff with a master's degree. And also is Dr. Steve Argue.
That's right.
Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. I'm the only doctor not in the room.
Well, then you better get to stepping, son.
Dr. Steve Argue is a professor at Fuller Seminary, part of the Fuller Youth Institute. We've done a lot of research with their stuff, writing our dissertations and our thesis. His focus is on youth ministry and emerging adults in their congregations. And he has an ebook releasing on March 24th titled Young Adult Ministry Now.
Right.
I'm sure you and I will be reading that one. So welcome to the table, Dr. Argue. Steve.
Hey, yeah, Rob, Jeff, thanks so much for having me. Please call me Steve, except Jeff, you need to call me Dr. Argue.
Love it.
And Rob does too, because that's the way we roll. I'm drinking coffee too. Just want to join you with that.
Excellent.
And I also, I do have a discipline of trying to drink about 3 cups of water before my coffee though. So I'm just connecting with both of you right at the moment.
Gotcha. You're such a great counselor. Like you're a great mediator. You know what I'm saying?
There.
Like,
I'm there for you guys.
In the middle.
People tell me you guys need that. So I guess that's
that's true. That's true. Yeah. So we talked off air and we have some commonality and some connections beside the water and the coffee.
Yeah.
Well, we have both lived in Wisconsin, Steve, and now you're in SoCal where Rob has had residency. So how does a guy who lived in the snowy land of Wisconsin end up in SoCal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And people do ask me about that. I was born and raised in the Midwest. We still have family and friends in Wisconsin and Illinois and Michigan. And so we're really grateful for that part of the country. And what was interesting is I was a pastor at a church in West Michigan called Mars Hill Bible Church. And I got connected with the gang at the Fuller Youth Institute way before I even worked there. And so I got to know Kara Powell and Brad Griffin and Irene Cho and Jake Mulder. And what was so cool about it is, as a pastor, they were really interested in what I thought of their work. And I wasn't always kind, but they listened anyway. And so we just developed a great connection. And so over the course of time, I did some work with them, and eventually Fuller invited me out to teach at the seminary. So I teach courses in youth, family, and culture. And I also research with FYI now. So it's just been a great connection to come out here and do what I love to do, teach students and research and do all that. And what I love about FYI is I think the listening that they did with me is something that still is a value with FYI. We really listen to the people that we want to serve. We want to take the most pressing questions that they have and do some research on it, and then turn around and try to resource youth pastors and leaders and parents out there that we believe are the rock stars of faith, and they just need some help along the way. And if we can do that, then that's a good thing.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Those names he listed were all in the footnotes of my thesis. Powell and Mulder.
Yeah.
It's like he just quoted my thesis outside of Kinnaman and the Barna group,
and Matlock and everybody else. Yeah,
those are the cornerstones of my thesis.
Well, from a disciplinary perspective, you're probably one of the I don't say with a few, but one of the guests that we've had on the show that most explicitly addresses or talks about or teaches on this area that we have sort of formed the podcast around, and this concept of young adults, or as you know, maybe a more academic term, emerging adults is maybe what is more commonly known as. So not everyone's going to fully understand the dynamics of that language. So can you just for a second just kind of unpack what you mean when you say young adults, emerging adults, and that whole conversation?
Yeah, appreciate that. And I think it's important. I mean, I think in most church circles, we hear this concept of young adults, and I think that's fine. I think in more academic realms, you hear this idea of emerging adulthood, which I think is important for us to understand so that we know who we're talking about. In academic circles, this idea of emerging adulthood is a period between about 18 and 29, and it's considered a developmental stage, kind of like adolescence. It comes after adolescence and before adulthood. And those who identify as emerging adults are usually on a quest to discover things about their identity or identities. Actually, we're trying to harmonize a lot of pieces of who we are, our sense of belonging and our sense of purpose. And a lot of times emerging adults feel in between because they're not teenagers anymore, but they're not adults either. And this longer road to adulthood is something that's more than just their choice. I think sometimes it's misunderstood, like, I just don't want to grow up, or I just kind of want to hang out in the basement of my parents and play video games. But what we find is that actually what's going on is that as a developmental stage, the brain is still developing. I'm coming to grips with who I am as a person. And so I'm developing my own strength with that. And we live in a world where it takes longer to grow up. The degrees that you guys are getting to become what you want to be, the support that we have to actually be independent and on our own through our 20s actually takes longer. So there's more preparation that's needed to become an adult, yet there's also less support. And I think what I try to communicate to leaders as well is that what I like about the term emerging adulthood is that it sort of situates in the 20s. And there's a lot of more we can say about it, which I won't in this podcast. But it's different than millennial or Gen Z. Millennial and Gen Z are sociological terms that define a period that is significant for a cohort of people that oftentimes has something unique that happens in a crucial time in their life when they're growing up that shapes who they are. So for a millennial, 9/11 would be crucial, at least for the United States, right? It's shaped the way I think about the world, others, myself, violence, safety, all those type of things. For Gen Z, we would say, obviously, the pandemic is shaping the way I think about public health, the way I think about the way the world works, the way I think about education or my family or these type of things. So, so these cohorts of millennial and Gen Z are great, but they're constantly getting older. Like when people talk about millennials, we just need to realize, and you guys know this, I mean, they're 40 years old. Like they're not like 20s anymore, right? So, so emerging adulthood allows us to really kind of focus in, I think, what you guys are really interested in, and that is this young adult period, really 18 to 29.
Yeah, that's good.
Steve, and this is sort of an academic question because I did some research on the emerging adulthood when I was writing my thesis for my master's degree.
Great.
When did it move from 25 to 29? So early on, it was 18 to 25. Like that was sort of that gap of emerging adulthood. When did it move now to all the way up to 29? Is it just, or is it mixed bag on who's saying that time frame?
Well, as you know from your own academic studies, there's always a lot of discourse and a mixed bag about it. Some would say that emerging adulthood now goes up to 35. It really depends on who you talk with. But what's unique about emerging adulthood, it's a term that was coined by Jeffrey Arnett around 1999, 2000. So if you think about it in that way, this study is only 2 decades old. So we're still sort of trying to come to grips with what it means, how broad the range goes, who's affected by it, and the fact that it's expressed itself in different sort of ways. It seems as though the collective understanding is that it really goes up to about 29, and 30 for an emerging adult is sort of the magic number. At 30, most emerging adults say, I want to have some traction in my life.
Yeah.
I want to kind of know where I'm going. Like talk to emerging adult and ask them like, I talked to them about the age 30 and they will have a bit of a panic attack inside. I've talked to some of my graduate students. They literally say there's a clock ticking in my head and it explodes at 30. There's something unique about 30 that is a bit symbolic for young adults that I think is important for us to pay attention to. And it's, it's vague. It's not actually a number 30, but it's the symbolism of it that I think is really, really powerful.
So let's continue the geek out here for a second, because I'm curious, like Chap Clark used to write a lot about extended adolescence. So how is like an extended adolescence and emerging adult sort of a parallel or a crossover, or, are those two completely different conversations? Like,
Yeah.
let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah. Well, I work with Chap. He's a good friend of mine and he's a brilliant man. So anything I say, Chap, I love you. I think because a lot of my research interests have focused in on undergraduates, on emerging adulthood, that type of thing. I really believe what the research is saying, that emerging adulthood is a unique, a new developmental period. I think if you look at the discourse, this idea of late adolescence was probably something that was more like in the 90s, as we were realizing that adolescence was kind of pushing beyond 18. And I think that was the nomenclature that seemed to work. The problem with it is that to call a 25-year-old an adolescent just seems kind of odd. It's actually quite offensive to a 20-something. Even the word 20-something is a bit offensive. And so I think what we just realized is that the language of adolescence has a shelf life, and something changes at 18 that's unique. And we know this from emerging adult literature as well, that generally speaking, and I'm being really, really general, a teenager up to age 18 has a similar sort of life experience, right? They're sort of expected to go to school. They live under the auspices of a parent or legal guardian. They may work, but their experiences are somewhat similar, but at 18, like everything changes, right? I mean, you could go to college, you could work, you could join the military, you could take a gap year. It's that moment that something switches in a young person's sort of psyche, and their options open up in ways that is really, really exciting and actually quite daunting for them, all wrapped up at once. So we see that there's something sort of signaling something different than adolescence sort of happening at 18.
Cool.
So Steve, the primary questions, and our listeners know this, that we founded the podcast on, that we thought we had answers to, or wanted to come to answers or conclusions.
We had no answers. Let's be honest.
Yeah, we still don't.
We had no answers.
And we're not sure we do now. But it's centered on two questions, and they were more at that point definitive. Why are young adults leaving the church?
Yeah.
And how can we engage them and recapture them or keep them in the church? And what we've learned a little bit is maybe they're not leaving the church, but leaving churches. So from your study, your perspective, what you're learning, are they leaving the church? Where are we at with that?
Yeah. Great question. And it is in some ways the $1 million question, right? As you know. So let me try to turn this in a couple of different ways, because I think it's actually a more complicated question than people always let it be. And maybe that's just the nerd professor in me that's talking right now. So are they leaving churches? Here's my answer. Yes and no. And we must ask why. Okay. So here's some things that we know to be true. That those that are in high school, that graduate from wherever they graduate from, usually we find, and the research seems to hold this to bear, that post high school, we see a drop in church attendance. Okay. And here's the kicker. That drop has been consistent since 1970. This isn't new. This is the fact that once one leaves home, something happens. And so a lot of people would say that the reason that we see a drop in church attendance among church people is an issue of differentiation. If I've been told my whole life that I need to go to church by my parents, which is a great thing. I totally encourage that. I'm not trying to say that's bad. And now I'm in my apartment or my dorm room for the first time. It's a Sunday morning. I was out late the night before. The birds are chirping. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm an adult now, or at least I'm not like at my parents' home anymore. What am I going to do on that Sunday morning? I'm not going to go to church. It's not because I hate God. I'm just trying to, in many ways, find my own sense of who I am. And so I think we have that going on. I think there are other researchers like Tim Clydesdale that would say that those that are just in their early 20s are going through this period of daily life management, that the deep questions of meaning are things that are important to me. But as I step into a world where I have to find new friends, perhaps do my homework, do a job, learn the daily life management of what it starts to feel like to be an adult, I take the existential questions that I have and I put them on a shelf, because I only have time to make friends, find food, and make sure that I get my homework done. Okay.
Right.
So this is a temporary move. that happens, that eventually, once I begin to sort of get this daily life management in order, I can begin to bring down the deep, meaningful questions of life that are important to me and begin to talk about them. I think this is one of the reasons why second, third, fourth year college students sometimes change their major. Right?
Yeah.
They've been told they were going to go into a particular major, or they're just interested in finding friends. And then all of a sudden they get a little bit further in and life begins to become more manageable. And they start to go, do I really want to do this?
Mm-hmm.
Is this what I'm really about? Is this what's really important to me? Am I just doing this because someone told me I was good at it? Or is this something I really, really want? And so we actually see it in our students that they begin to ask the deeper meanings of life a little bit later on associated with that. So I think that they're thinking about these things. And I think as a result, I think that they're just not showing up at churches. And so at the same time, I don't think that means that they're leaving faith. I actually think that they're pursuing something. And maybe that's the better question. We always ask the question, why are they leaving church, or are they leaving a church? But maybe the question is, well, where are they going? We know a lot of things, right? We know that probably half of the startups happening in this world are done by emerging adults. Half of those are women. They're going to gap years, base camps, yoga studios, online networks, places where they can find community and purpose. And I think that one of the things the church needs to realize is that when we say we're a church, we have community, come here. There's lots of places for community for young adults, right? That's not necessarily like a distinction anymore. And I think what this means is that we find a lot of times that we critique young adults for not showing up at a prescribed day and time of the week for them to show up. And then we get mad when they don't, or we make assumptions about them not being there. But maybe what we need is a broader imagination and recognize the fact that just because young people aren't showing up where we expect them to show up doesn't mean they're not showing up.
Right.
And I feel like we have a learned blind spot as leaders sometimes, and a limited imagination of the amazing things that I know you guys know that young adults are doing and care about and want to be a part of. And so I'd love to spend more time encouraging people to explore those spaces rather than worrying about the fact that they're not showing up at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning somewhere.
It's a really interesting framework to rebuild from, because I think even as recently, I would say within the last couple of months, even Jeff and I alone, and I think he's kind of mentioned it a little bit. I mean, even now we're wondering, okay, are we really asking the right questions? Are they leaving church, and how do we get them to stay?
Yeah.
Terry Parkman, we recently had on the show. We had a great conversation with him, and kind of his framework was they're not leaving the church, they're actually changing it, right? And so I think it's a microcosm of the point that you just made that I think often gets overlooked, and that is not the church is not the only or the distinctive community anymore. Young adults, emerging adults are finding community in a vast multitude of reflections. Yeah. And it's satisfying those relational and emotional needs in a lot of ways that we would say the classically practicing church on a Sunday morning would typically fulfill, right? And so maybe the harder question, or the better question, depending on how you want to phrase it, is how do we be the church in those spaces?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And I know that there's a theological conundrum there. I know all about the ecclesia and all that's, like, I understand that, like, but how are we being the gospel or being the church in those spaces rather than expecting them to accommodate necessarily the space that we provide? And I know that that's a huge tension, because there's a lot of value in the local church and what it looks like. You know what I'm saying? So
absolutely.
So how do you deal with that tension a little bit?
Well, I find it interesting that when people ask, well, why are young people leaving the church, or how do we get them back? Do you notice who's always moving in those questions? Young people. Young
exactly.
Adults. And the church is never moving. And so I'm all about the gathered community. I just need to recognize, I think the gathered community needs to recognize that part of the calling of the church is to give itself away, to show up in the places where young adults say they need the church the most. And quite frankly, I just want all our friends listening in to hear. I mean, I think we're all about the church. I don't think that's the problem. I think the forms of church can take different forms, however, and I think we just need to recognize that a lot of the forms of church that we hold right now are embedded in a way of thinking, of teaching and learning, of culture that really isn't theological. It's much more cultural. And so can we decouple those a little bit and hold on to a good theology of what the church is about and recognize the fact that maybe what we need to do with the church is give ourselves away? And this gets into issue of power. This gets into issues of privilege. This gets into all these sort of issues as well. Because quite frankly, and I'll just get a little fired up here for a second, there's just a lot of churches that aren't interested in young adults because they don't have money to give and they don't have time to invest in the way that churches want to. So knowingly or unknowingly, I fear that some churches are kind of like, they're just not a really good investment of our time. Our ROI of investing in them isn't the same as the middle class professional that has, 2 kids and a dog and, that type of thing. You know what I mean? So, but if we care, if we actually believe that that young adults are worth it, if we actually believe that they hold the questions and a vision of the kingdom of God that we need, then it's worth it. And we better figure out ways to connect with them. And I think part of that is on us as an older generation to do that. Psychologically, this is something interesting to think about. If we think about power for a second, is that I think in a lot of churches too, I think that the messaging is, once I have the power, then I can control the way church works and I can get what I want. And so what happens is every generation finally gets a hold of the power, and what do? They don't give it away, right? What would happen if those that have the power actually give it away? What will the next generation do? They'll go, boy, I saw a generation that had the power and they gave it away. What am I going to do? I'm going to give it away. So we have a dysfunctional way of thinking about what we at FYI would call keychain leadership, in the sense that it's hard to give power away for the sake of the other, and we hold on to it. And so we have a dysfunctional problem associated with that. And so I just think there's a lot of things that we can do if we open up our imaginations and actually take some risks.
Yeah, and I think that's an ascription to human nature, right? I mean, we see this in political realms where, someone overthrows a dictator and now all of a sudden they're in charge, and what do? They become maybe a more benevolent dictator, but a dictator nonetheless, right? Absolutely. So it's just an aspect of human nature that we have to contend with, and yes, even in the church. Yep. And if we could just call it what it is and have more open dialogue and more honest dialogue about those power dynamics that exist, I think you're right. It would change a lot.
I fear that our generation, Gen X, because it felt like we had to wait a long time for our turn. That now that we're getting power, let's say, or control or whatever it is, that we may not release it so quickly. All the things we said we would do, like, if you give us a chance, as Gen Xers, we're gonna do whatever, So my hope is that we, because we've waited so long, it feels like a lot of us to get into leadership, that I hope that that's not the case. So that we live open-handed, we live aware that we didn't get our turn, let's say, however we want to phrase that, or didn't get the opportunities that maybe we felt were afforded to us, or pathways made for us. I think it's why church planning was huge and still is right now, because we just were like, hey, let's go carve our own path. Right. That we would be sort of I hate to use a John the Baptist term, but the forerunners for others to come behind us. So how do we, when we get the authority, really open spaces for other people and not live close-handed with it, but live open-handed to help this generation that's coming up that has lots of zeal, lots of passion for the Lord, to get them into place quicker?
Well, you guys tell me. You guys are doing cool stuff. I mean, I think I'll tell you one place I think we have to start, and this may not seem strategic, but I think sometimes it's overlooked. And I know that you guys work with young adults, so you'll be able to appreciate this. I think we just have to say we're sorry.
Yeah.
I find that a lot of young adults are really not interested in new ideas until some of the hurt and pain has been addressed. I feel in in the work that I do, that there have been places where I feel like I've really advocated for young people, and there's some places that I've perpetuated some things that have caused pain, right?
Yeah.
And I think a younger generation just needs to hear, we love you. We've blown it in some ways. You've inherited a world and a church that we've given you, that has beauty, but also has some really harsh edges to it. And we just want to say we're sorry. And I think that's a great place to start. I mean, in some ways, we kind of need to be a healthy church. I think we just have to sort of admit that, rather than expecting that we just kind of move on. I mean, that's just like classic, like family systems, right? Like, don't talk about the elephant in the room. You know? It's like, oh man. So, I think that's a start. I think we also just need to recognize that, I've been saying this for a while, but I mean, young people aren't the problem of the church. They're actually our prophets. The questions they're asking, the things they're thinking about, I think we need to listen to it and not be so quick to dismiss. Some of the things that are said aren't necessarily done tactfully, or maybe are fully thought through. But I think when young adults have the courage to speak up, I think maybe we can develop the ability to just to lean in and listen a little bit more. We actually need to. This is actually it's just not like fuzzy feeling. I actually think it's getting harder. I mean, we talk about this. I talk about this in the book a little bit, but so we have two hurdles to really connecting with young adults. One is closeness bias. A lot of adults think that they understand young adults because they were young adults once, when I was your age, that phrase. The reality is that the world is moving faster and faster in such a way that when we think that we understand young adults, we actually don't. And closeness bias is when we think that we're familiar with people that we're close to, and we stop asking them questions.
Yeah.
So this is a problem where we make assumptions about people that aren't actually true, or we haven't caught up. The second thing is, and this gets a little bit to what I just said, it's what I'm calling intra-generational speed. We talked a little bit earlier about like the generations being like 20 years, you have Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z. But what we're actually finding, what some sociologists and philosophers are saying, is that actually this generational cohort of 20 years, which is, always a bit artificial, is actually shrinking. That within 20 years, you don't have one cohort, you actually have like 4 or 5 cohorts. Meaning that the college students that are graduating the university as seniors had a completely different freshman experience than the freshmen that are coming in now. Like, take the pandemic out of it for a second. Why? Because technology, communication, education, resourcing, global impact, everything that's happening is changing so quickly that the overlap of a common experience is less and less, which means we can't make assumptions about each other's experience. We actually have to lean a little more to understand. So empathy is a crucial step toward understanding, and we can't make assumptions about the people that we serve.
Yeah.
And I think, there's such a wake up call for this kind of conversation. And I think part of the motivation for Jeff and I to kind of do the whole show, to go through this whole process, was because we genuinely want to help local churches wake up to this reality, because I think the American church, and I'm always very careful to be critical of the American church because I love it. Yeah. But I think the American church is so far down on the backside of the bell curve that we don't really have much time or many options before we start talking about change or die scenarios. You know what I'm saying? Like we really, as leaders, Xers, as Zers or whoever, like we really, as leaders, we have to be able to create opportunities where dialogue is open and it's free and it's empathetic and it's understanding and it's just, discipleship oriented. We have to be able to create spaces where these kind of things can happen. And I think the struggle for a lot of leaders, including myself, is not only that we don't ask questions, we don't actually know what questions to ask. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Because we feel so out of sync because technology, education, all the things you just mentioned are going so fast, I can't keep up.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of throw up my hands and say, well, I'm just going to finish the race the best I can, and we'll see what happens.
Totally true. Like a generation ago, your sermons weren't fact checked by smartphones.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like it is a different game for leaders out there. And, I think I really appreciate what you're saying, and that I think we just need to have empathy for leaders as well. Like more is expected of pastors than ever before. And leaders than ever before. And it's hard. I just want to really agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
There.
I mean, it's one thing when people would gather over lunch and criticize your sermon. It's when they live yik yak.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Not actually yik yakking your sermon and like crushing you anonymously.
The one social media app I will not get on is Yik Yak. I don't think my ego can handle it, bro. I'd be crushed.
But I mean,
I crushed.
That's the shift we've made. And I think, Rob, great point. We don't know what questions to ask.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Steve, I call you Dr. Steve. How's that work?
Wow, it's nice.
All right. We have to do more listening. So how do we create spaces then to gather students and listen? Like if I'm the leader, if I'm the pastor driving my car right now, and I'm pastoring 130, 150 people, we've got 5 or 6 young adults. Yeah. How do I go, hey, I want to listen to you? Where do I begin with that?
Yeah, well, I love your example, because I think in some ways, I think if you're a smaller church, you actually have more nimbleness to actually listen. I think the larger you are, it's more complicated. So all you pastors out there that maybe feel like your church needs to be bigger, or you need more money to reach young adults, no, you're it. Like we need you. And here's what you do. You text a young adult and you say, hey, let's go grab coffee. And I just want to hear about your life. And I'll buy. And I guarantee that half the time a young adult's probably going to be open to that. And, I think there's a couple things that are happening there. One is I think we just have to listen with no agenda. Like we're not trying to figure out how we can get them connected with the youth group to be a leader, or we're going to, hey, I want to know what you think about what kind of midweek thing we can do, and I need your input to represent all young adults. I mean, I just think just asking them about their lives and what they're up to, I think is really important. And what this does, I think, for us as leaders, is it gives us an instinct to be more fluid and able to have some fluency in just talking with young adults again. No joke. One of our research projects, we just finished this 5-year research project where we worked with over 40 churches and hundreds of leaders, and actually impacting thousands of young adults. One of the exercises that we had them do, it was like, it just sounds so funny, but it was amazing, is we just said, okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to go and have conversations with young adults. And they're like, oh yeah, well, all right, whatever. And the funny thing is they came back and they were like, that was amazing. I didn't realize what was going on with them. You know what they told me? This is what I'm thinking about now. And again, I think just these conversations can be really, really helpful. One of the things that I talk about in a parenting book I wrote for emerging adults, I just say one of the phrases that you just can never stop using as a 3-word phrase that I would just encourage everybody to use more and more. And it's these 3 words: tell me more. Mm-hmm. Someone says something, don't try to answer it. Don't try to respond. Just say, tell me more about that. So what's that like to still be looking for a job and you're not exactly sure where to find one? Oh, so yeah, tell me more. And let young adults be the expert in their lives to you, so that you can seek to understand who they are. I actually think young adults just kind of want to be seen and heard on their own terms rather than otherwise. And again, I there's no secret sauce to that, but here's what makes this so hard. It takes time. And the other thing is that if we believe that there's something of the Spirit working when 2 or 3 are gathered, I believe that's a formational moment
Mm.
where we actually can be changed in these conversations. And that for some people is really scary, because all of a sudden I have to be open to not only being in a conversation, to listen to somebody else with the hopes that maybe they'll change or come to my church. I have to be open to actually changing myself. That's a beautiful and scary moment, but that sounds pretty Jesus-y to me.
Yeah. So stick with me here for a second. I'm going somewhere.
Okay.
So my Lent season this year, my focus is on motivational holiness, like understanding the raw motivations of my heart for the relationships that I have, the networks that I build, etc. And this particular one with young adults is also a part of that, because I think what you're saying is, don't ask a young adult to go to coffee so that you can get them know to better, so that you know where to plug them in or what to ask them for, because I know me as a leader, my age, where I am, I need them to be the face of what I'm trying to do. You understand what I'm saying? So, in order for us to really accomplish what Jeff and I call reverse mentoring, it's not so much about learning who they are so you know where to plug them in. It's about learning who they are so you know where they are, where they're coming from, how God is moving in their life. You know what I'm saying?
And what they can teach you.
And what they can teach you about yourself. And so I'm really kind of personally on this journey, especially during this Lenten season, of focusing on my own motivational holiness, which is an invitation to really know people for who people are, right? And I think that's what a young adult and emerging adult is really after. And of course, they're going to say ridiculous things, and of course, they're going to have inexplicable emotional sort of, whatever. Like, and of course, they don't have enough depth or experience to frame a cohesive thought on their career path or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's just about the presence of being.
I think what we're saying a lot at the table here is that though they may all dress alike, they may not admit they dress alike, they are deeply individuals, and they want to be seen as individuals.
Yeah.
Like, they'll follow a trend, and they'll change a trend with the trend as fast as it can go, but deep down they want to be seen and known individually. And I think that's the part of the listening that we got to go, hey, listen, I don't want you to represent the whole of everybody and tell me how to dress better on stage as a pastor, but let me know who you are. And that being seenness it speaks volumes, I think, to emerging adults, to especially Gen Z. And so I think for leaders, we have to really start to be able to see them individually, which is hard if you're pastoring a large congregation. Like, because you have this like wide berth of everybody, and you have a generation that wants to be seen individually. So there's some tension there. And that may be where young adult ministry comes in. Your new ebook is Young Adult Ministry Now. Is young adult ministry the answer? Like, it's sort of a new trend. Is it what we need now?
Yeah. I'm thinking about so many things you guys are talking about. So really quick to the conversation you guys ended up with before. So in a focus group of young adults, they were talking about these conversations. And one of the young adults says, oh yeah, they're like, I hate the bait and switch. And all the young adults were like, oh yeah. And I was like listening, and I was like pretending like I knew what they were talking about. And being a good researcher, I was like, what do you mean by the bait and switch? They're like, oh, this is where like churches pretend like they're really interested in us. And then that's the bait. And the switch is they start like telling us all the places they want us to volunteer, the things that they want us to do. So our value is only seen as valuable if they contribute to the institution. I'm not valued just on my own.
Right.
And I was like, oh my gosh, God forbid that I treat young adults like the bait and switch. Right. So anyway, I was reflecting on what you guys just said, and I'm just really resonating with that. Okay, so you want to talk about this idea of young adult ministry now? Yeah, this is what I think about that. I don't think young adult ministry now is a program. Young adult ministry now is a posture, and let me frame this in a couple of ways that I think is important. First of all, if we know from emerging adulthood that the road to adulthood takes longer, so what young adults need is more grace and support. And think about a lot of our churches. The assumption is that you get married early and you start a family. And so most of our programming is great up to 18. We don't know what to do with them, quote unquote, in the early 20s until one gets married or anything else. And so I think this becomes a problem. I had one young adult say to me, my church is the only place that people constantly ask me about my marriage status.
Yeah.
That's not good. That's not good. So I think we need to reimagine the fact that there is a unique experience that has happening through the 20s of which young adults need support. And young adult ministry now takes that seriously of what that support looks like. I'll explain what I think we can do in that in a second. Secondly, we just need to remember that the road to adulthood for a young adult is more diverse. So there's not going to be a one size fits all. I think we can get away with that in children's ministry and youth ministry, right? All of a sudden, though, when you have the diversity of young adults and the journeys they're on, we just need to recognize the fact that we probably have to be more particular, and it's going to be a less efficient approach that we're going to take. So there's just a little bit more customization that has to happen and particularity that we need to think about in our posture for that. And then third, I think that because culture has speeding up and there's less overlapping experiences, we just need more intentionality. And it's what we've been talking about before, just leaning in a bit more. And so I think that what this means for young adult ministry now is that the 20s are a time that takes longer to grow up. But there are researchers that would also say that the 20s are a time of investment, and both are important. There are some young adults that think they'd have longer to grow up and they waste their 20s. And they're, as Meg Jay would say, psychologist, she would say, those in their 30s sometimes said that their resumes look better at 20 than they did at 30, right? They've treated their 20s as an extended adolescence rather than a decade of investment. If we say that this is a time of an investment, how might we help those in their 20s live into God's calling for their lives so that when they hit 30, they can say, I think I know who I am. I think I know where I'm going. I think I know what I'm about. And so this idea of investment then, I think, plays to the strength of the church. And this is what I'm most excited about. What the church has that a lot of other institutions don't have is an intergenerational instinct. We actually gather in different generations. That doesn't always happen, especially more in like in like the United States, which is really powerful. And we also have a wealth of wisdom and experience, of life that's lived, of careers, of experiences, and everything else. And what young adults need, they don't need a program. They need to talk with a business person who is as they're trying to figure out what it means to follow Jesus into accounting, what it means to follow Jesus into motherhood, what it means to follow Jesus into social action, what it means to follow Jesus into teaching, what it means to follow Jesus into community, whatever it might be. I believe that if we can teach our community how to have conversations with young adults, I think young adults would be lining up the doors of most churches because there's a wealth of information and wisdom that we can give away. And that's our strength. And that is our assets. And truly, that is the good news for young adults today. The key is to be ready to do that. And I think young adults would find a tremendous amount of help with that. So what it requires of a church, and it can express itself in different sort of ways, but I think it's a reimagining of what we have to offer and really asking this question of where do young adults need us the most? The second thing I'll say with regards to this is that young adulthood is a time of transition, but I think this is misunderstood. When we talk about transition, a lot of times we assume that it's temporary. Like if we can just hold on and they can get through the transition, they'll eventually come back. We'll eventually kind of reset. We just kind of got to get through this little bumpy time and it'll be all over. Let me explain to you what we've been learning through the work at Fuller Youth Institute of what we think transition is. What if we were to think about young adulthood as a decade of transition, particulated with particular transitions that are happening throughout: vocational transitions, relational transitions, educational transitions, spiritual transitions. All these things are happening along the way. And these transitions are not the exception, but they're the rule. As a matter of fact, equanimity is particular. It only happens every once in a while. We're actually trying to serve a generation that's on the move. Now, if we assume that that's the case, then as churches, we're not surprised when people are in transition, right? We actually assume that that's the way we do ministry. The problem is that most churches, where do they spend most of their time? On the stable parts. Come to my church every week at this particular time. Young adults are like, yeah, that's not going to happen, right? Come to this church in this particular area where you drive every week. That's going to happen. What does a church that oftentimes is in living a life of stability and is thinking about things through the lens of stability, how do they serve a generation that's on the move?
Yeah.
And if we can begin to ask that question, all of a sudden we realize that we have resources and imagination that can actually not freak out when we see young adults in transition, but we actually recognize the fact that maybe that's the place where they need us the most. So how do we step into those places? How do we allow for work there? And I think this just opens up a whole new possibilities of the way we think about how we gather, how we mentor, how we worship, how we disciple. And this is where I think there's tremendous hope and possibility. And so what we try to do in the book is try to unpack that. And here's why it's young adult ministry now. That's not a panic title. The idea is that young adults can't wait for churches to someday catch up to their life experiences right now. They actually need help now. And as church leaders, we need to take risks to do that. Not panic, but not think that somehow if we can just wait it out, they're all going to come around. We're going to actually not serve a generation very well, and I won't have it. I don't think you guys will either. Yeah. So that's what I'm really excited about.
Yeah, we're not going to have it.
My brain is swirling with about 4 different questions. So I want to push on a couple things here.
I'm like, man, I got to go back to my dissertation.
First, I want to talk about the transition and the stability piece. So how does the church, pardon me, because I think stability is important for a generation that's in constant transition, if that makes sense. So the church having some stability. So how does the church be stable and flexible then to be able to bend with the transitional pieces of this generation? Because I live it out all the time. We serve a lot of young adults in our church, and we see it, and the life is constantly shifting, but they're also searching for stability. So how can the church hold the tension of being the stable place, but being flexible through the transitions that they're walking through?
Yeah, well, in a very basic way, in a very practical way, maybe for some of our leaders out there, is that just don't ask a young adult to commit to something for a year. I mean, at our church, we just had something called short circles. They were 6-week small groups. And we're just like, hey, we're going to do things for 6 weeks. After that, one of the hardest things in Christian circles, have you noticed, like, people feel really guilty about leaving small group. Like, I don't mean to do this to you, but I'm going to leave. Like, people are in small groups for years because they just don't want to leave them, right?
Yeah.
And young adults just can't do it. So what do young adults do? The mentality of a young adult is this: because I don't know if I'm going to be here next year, because I'm in school, or because I might get transferred, or I might do a startup somewhere else, I'm not going to invest. Why? Because I don't want to say goodbye. How do we create a space where we can say 6 weeks is a worthy investment, and it's okay? You can come, you can go. We will love you while you are here. We will bless you when you will go. I think that young adults need to know that that's okay. Oftentimes in churches, the narrative is sign your name on the dotted line with blood, and if you leave, we'll pray for you, right? So you know what I mean? So I think there's ways that we just have to sort of reimagine and honor the transitionness of young adults without making them feel guilty about that. And this is where I think the stability comes in. If they do 6 weeks, I'm just using this as an example, you can say to them, and we'll be here after the 6 weeks. If you guys think it was a great experience, you want to keep going, we're here for you, right?
Mhm.
So there's the stability that we leverage, but we honor the transitions that they're in as well. So that'd be like one example. You know what I mean? I think there's lots of examples like that. But.
So that's a shift in values orientation then for quote unquote the local church, right?
Mhm.
Which, let's be honest, is a huge ask, right? Having
Right.
been a senior pastor, Jeff's a senior pastor. I don't exactly know what your pastoral ministry experience is fully, but
Yeah.
that's a huge ask for a local church to shift that values orientation into that sort of smaller bite chunks. I mean, it's important.
Yeah.
I think we can do it. I think we ought to do it.
Yeah.
I think the hard sell, I think for a lot of leaders, and I don't know how to conquer this, unfortunately, because if I did, I'd probably have a New York Times bestseller. But the point is, the ROI on that is not tangible.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to let that go. The tangibility of the ROI and the tangibility of a spiritual ROI are not the same.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a kingdom mentality that I think we have lost in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because of the pressures of performance and the pressures of platforms, that we're unwilling and unable in some cases to even make those shifts that we want to make.
Right.
Yeah.
The whole reality is about to be tested in my world. As our church, we planted the church about 6-7 months ago, centering around young adults, college students. And one of our values is this idea of releasing. And I've got some great young adults in my church who are going to graduate and move on. And part of me goes, I don't want you to leave because you're valuable here.
Yeah.
But where you go, you're going to make a greater impact. And so by releasing you, there's greater kingdom impact. And I have to be able to count that as the win. Where you go and impact, that's a win. Maybe not inside the walls of this local confined thing we call church, but the kingdom win is that you go to Columbia and you start that mission or that whatever, and that's hard as a local pastor to go, I'm going to live so open-handed that the wins are when you leave.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you guys are explaining something that my colleague, Scott Cormode, is a leadership professor at Fuller, says. He says, as leaders, we need to tell stories of future hope.
Yeah.
And what we do is we have to create new and small narratives that our communities begin to believe, because our churches hold a narrative of the way things ought to be. We all have narratives, right? And so we evaluate based on those narratives. And if my narrative is, you are a faithful member of this church if you're here by the number of years that you're here, right? The subtext is, hi, my name's Steve. I've been at this church for 9 years. You see what we're doing there? We're actually putting value on that, right? But if we say, hey, let me tell you about Samantha. Samantha is a graduate student. She was only here 6 months, but she was with us and she was part of this small group. And she said she needed us for this small amount of time. And now she's moving on to do a postdoc. But when she was here, she said, I loved this person and that person. And I'm so grateful for that moment. We just want to pray for her and bless her and send her on. What that begins to do is that's a story of future hope. Now the community goes, you know what we're about? We are the exchange zone in a triathlon where when young people come through, they're refreshed and cheered, and then they move on because we're about the kingdom, right? That's it's the same thing, but the narrative is different. So when we tell those stories of future hope, man, that changes everything, right? So yeah.
And there's a lot of churches saying this little cliche that we're not about seating capacity, we're about sending capacity, but they're not sending anybody.
Well, it's values, or it comes back to values orientation. I don't care what your mission statement is.
Yeah.
If you're not living it out, if it's not what you're promoting as a narrative from the pulpit or in your other leadership context or whatever. If the values don't match the message, nobody's listening, right? I mean, it doesn't work. So if your values are matching your message, if we're able to shift, we're trying, right? I mean, then you're getting it. So, okay. So here's the thing. We are ridiculously out of time, right? That's the bad news, because if you're listening, we actually didn't get to half the questions on the sheet. So that just means there's a part two probably coming somewhere in the news.
Sheet,
well, listen, we're good reporters. We're good journalists. We're good researchers. We've got a sheet in front of us. So that probably means there's a part two, but we do have one question that we ask all of our guests that we would love to ask you at the end of every show. So what is one lesson you learned in college that did not take place in the classroom?
So you guys are going to hate me for my answer, but my answer is every lesson. And this is why I think that classroom always raise topics, but the conversations always happen beyond the classroom.
Wow.
And you guys will know this in your research as well. Classroom and formal settings are high risk. That's not where things really happen. And we know from student development that there are two campuses on every campus. There's day campus and night campus. Day campus is where I show up for class. Night campus is where the real meaning making happens. And so here's the kicker when we think about young adult ministry. Where do we look for where young adults are making meaning? Day campus sometimes is Sunday morning, 9 a.m. That's not where the meaning making is happening.
Yeah.
Where are the night campus spaces that young adults are showing up, and how do we pay attention to that? I think that's true for you and me. I think it's true for young adults. I think it's true for all of us. And so I think where we look, our view shapes our ministry. It shapes the way we respond to young adults, and it shapes the way that we talk about good news. So I maybe sidestep the question a little bit, but I really think it's true. And I think you guys would resonate with that. I think that's what you're trying to do with your ministries. And I think there's a lot of listeners out there that are recognizing that day campus programmatic young adult ministry isn't working. But here's the good news. There's lots of other spaces to look. And I think we've got some smart people and compassionate people who love Jesus that are willing to step into those spaces. And that's what gets me pretty excited.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Gosh, such good stuff. Well, it's Dr. Steve Argue. Again, the book coming out, it's an ebook, Young Adult Ministry Now. That'll be available on March 24th. Should be shortly after the release of this podcast episode, I think, or right in line with it. So, and as we always say here at the Leadership Drip, you have a seat at the table. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Leadership Drip. If something from this episode was helpful for you, then share it on your social media and tag us. If we see it, we may reshare it on our channels. We appreciate you taking the time to join us, and remember, you always have a seat at the table.